Thank you, Sheldon. Sheldon told me that if I had called him before I offered Bruce the job, that I probably wouldn't have offered Bruce the job. So I don't really know what that means, but we've got a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for asking us to present. And ahead of time, I'm going to thank you all for spending a little bit of time getting to know this issue a little bit. It's a complicated issue. Alaska's got the most complex oil taxes in the nation, in North America, probably in the world. And it's not as easy as reading a bumper sticker and trying to understand what exactly the problem is and what we need to do about it. So ahead of time, I appreciate the time that you're all going to spend digging into this issue a little bit. Facts to begin the conversation, just to kind of give a setting of where we are, both in Alaska and in the nation. Oil prices that had bounced around between $10 and $30 for decades have risen up in the last 5 to 7 years to around $100 or higher. Historically, the world's never seen prices like this. In fact, today it's $120 for Alaska North Slope crude. As a result, we're seeing an explosion of new exploration, development, and production all over the world, because a lot of the projects that might not have been economic at $20 a barrel or $30 a barrel are economic at 70, at 80, at 100. So we're seeing an explosion pretty much everywhere with the exception of our state. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline continues its decline. Late 80s, early 90s, we were over 2 million barrels a day going through taps. We're down under 600,000 now. We're dropping 6 to 7% a year. And competition is high. Big difference now in the state of Alaska than it was in 1989 when we were sitting on the largest untapped oil reservoir in North America. 10 to 12 billion barrels of oil sitting in Prudhoe Bay. It didn't really matter as much what our taxes were, what our tax credits were. There was such a massive amount of oil that just putting a hole in the ground was bringing up very high pressure, 90+% oil with a little bit of gas and a little bit of water. That's completely changed. If you go up on the North Slope now, low pressure field, they're having to pump 8 to 8.5 trillion cubic feet of gas into the field to bring the pressure up. And what they are getting out of the field is 90+% water and natural gas and a little bit of oil. So it's not only is it much more expensive to produce oil in the North Slope than it used to be, but we're also in competition for investment dollars because we're not sitting on the massive reservoir we were 30 years ago. I know Juneau, more than most communities, is certainly aware of the strong reliance the state of Alaska has on the oil industry being healthy. Last year, 92% of our state budget was paid for by taxes and royalties off oil. So that's paying for everything. That's paying for education, for transportation, public safety, the marine highway system, corrections. Everything we rely on in Alaska is, at this point, coming from oil. We don't have a state income tax. We don't have a state sales tax. We get our permanent fund checks. We've been very, very fortunate as Alaskans, but that's been reliant on a healthy oil industry, and that's something that we're not seeing anymore to the degree we did in the past. According to the United States Geological Survey, the federal government as well as the state government, it's not a resource issue, because I know some folks have said, we're running out of oil, we need to get every dollar we can before it goes away, but that's not the case. In fact, USGS doesn't even consider the North Slope of Alaska a mature oil field. They point out that over 70% of state land up there has been minimally explored. And the main reason for that is once they hit Prudhoe Bay, it was such a massive field that not only did all the exploration from other areas of the North Slope all go to the one area where they knew for a fact there was oil, but Cook Inlet and other areas that were beginning to get explored in the state almost came to a standstill as well, as everybody headed to that small Prudhoe Bay Kaparic area. It's estimated that the oil up on the North Slope is approximately 40 billion barrels. And that's just a very rough estimate based on the geology. It could be more, it could be less. We won't know until we have enough exploration to take a look at it to know specifically what's there. We also know we have between 2 to 250 trillion cubic feet of gas on the North Slope, and it's likely much more than that if you include the outer continental shelf and other areas. So it's a massive amount of natural gas up there. We also, looking down the road, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, have a lot of opportunities in non-conventional oil. There are tens of billions of barrels of heavy oil, very heavy oil on the North Slope. It's not now currently economic. Both BP and Conoco are spending quite a bit of money to try to figure out how to make it economic. You might have seen BP spending $100 million on their project. And to give you an idea, light oil, which is what has been produced up to now, pours like water. Heavy oil pours like slow molasses to even peanut butter. Very, very thick, very difficult to get out of the ground. And once you do get it out of the ground, another issue is trying to get it down the pipeline. They know there's got to be a mix of light oil and heavy to get it down there, and it's important that when we do get to the point of developing it, that we actually have enough light oil to get that down the pipeline. Shale oil is another potential opportunity on the North Slope. And I'm sure most of you have read about the huge shale oil explosion in North Dakota. It's also going on in the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas. Well, up on the North Slope, there's estimated to be 3 different shale formations larger than the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. It's the rock that formed Prudhoe Bay. And this winter, for the first time, there's going to be a company up there that's going to be drilling down and getting a better idea of exactly what we're looking at in terms of the shale. But once again, that's a question, when is it economic? Are we going to be able to get it out of the ground, or will we be able to get it into the pipeline? This is something that's years away, but has a lot of potential. The question is, do we ever get there? More important points, as a state, we're in a position we've never been in before. Couple different ways. Number one, as I mentioned, we're not sitting on a huge untapped reservoir anymore, but also we have a lot more information about what's going on in the oil patch than we used to. Until 2006, the state of Alaska had a gross tax where we simply taxed on a certain percentage of what the production was times what the price was. Didn't know a whole lot about what the spending was doing. In 2006, when we switched to a net tax, we now have detailed information about what's actually going on the North Slope, what companies are paying to operate, what companies are paying in capital. So we're able to have a better idea of where they're spending, where they're not spending, and as we go into the oil tax debate, we know a lot more than was known in 2006, 2007, when the policymakers were basing their decisions on expert testimony, models being worked out. They really didn't know a whole lot. We knew, coming from ELF, that taxes needed to come up. They were far too low. The state of Alaska wasn't getting what they should have been getting. But we didn't know exactly what the ramifications of raising that tax were going to be. Were we going to raise it too high, not high enough? Could we really hit the sweet spot with very little information? In our opinion, we didn't. We went high. And it needs an adjustment. And as a result, Department of Revenue has been compiling a 5-year look back. We've given presentations this week in the House and the Senate to try to show here's where the money's going, or in the case of exploration, here's where the money's not going. This graph is probably the most interesting one you'll see today, and we only have about 8 or 10 of them, so there's not a whole lot. But it shows you, and I'm sorry, I'll try to get out of the way here. It shows you from 1977, when we first started sending oil down taps, to 2011, what's happened with the largest oil-producing jurisdictions in North America. And as you can see, just because North Dakota is a topic of conversation, it's at the bottom, a red line. It just kind of bounced around fairly low until the last few years when shale oil became economic, and it's rising tremendously. Initially, the estimate was they were going to pass us in oil development in about 18 months. I just talked to the revenue commissioner down there. He thinks within a year, North Dakota is going to be passing us in production. The green dotted line you can see is the price. And as I talked about before, it just kind of bounced around between $10 and $30, $35 for decades and then shot up. And the darker red line is Alberta, which passed us the late 90s and has increased its curve upward as the price of oil has gotten higher and oil sands have become economic to develop. But the most interesting part about this slide is comparisons to Alaska and Texas. Because a lot of people say it's a natural decline, there's nothing we can do about it. And Texas has been producing oil for 80 years longer than Alaska has. And you can see when we shot up and peaked in our oil production of 2 million barrels, the late 80s, early 90s, we kind of met up with Texas in terms of the two highest producing states. Our decline curves for a couple of decades are almost identical. And then about 2005, when the price of oil went up to $100 and all kinds of production was now economic, along with technological increases that wasn't previously, you can see Texas flatten out, and you can see Texas start to turn it around. Alaska continues on the same decline curve that Texas was previously on. And when I first looked at this slide, the first thought was, well, they're developing shale oil, that's why, this isn't conventional oil. But we talked to the department and they said no. Up till 2011, that turnaround is all conventional oil. And now that shale oil is playing into it, they said in 2011, 2012, you're really going to see an increased spike as they increase production in Texas. In talking about ACES, which is the current, Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share, the current oil tax, there's really, to simplify it, two main pieces. And they kind of have to be talked about independent of each other to kind of understand how it works. The first piece of it is tax credits. We have very generous tax credits in this state where if you're an explorer and you come in and you want to explore, do business up on the North Slope, the state of Alaska reimburses you, depending on what tax credits you utilize, 40%, 50%, 60%, a giant chunk of your cost of exploration the state of Alaska picks up, whether it's a dry hole or a producing hole. So a lot of wildcatters, a lot of smaller companies are very excited about this because it gives them an opportunity to move forward and develop and explore in Alaska and not have some of the cash flow issues they would have if they were having to pay for everything that they were doing up there. The downside is the other piece of ACES, which is the production tax. And we have a progressivity tax in the state where the higher the price of oil gets, the higher the state take is. And that's not that uncommon of a way of taxing. What is uncommon is how highly progressive it is. And to give you an example, if the price of oil goes up $1 today from $120 to $121, approximately 90% of that dollar comes to the government. Most of it to the state of Alaska, some of it to the federal government. The company gets to keep 10% of that increase. And so on the high ends, companies really they don't see the opportunity to recoup their expenses, their front-end expenses, like they see in other states, Texas, North Dakota, and Alberta. And to give you an idea, Shell is trying to explore in the OCS off the coast of the North Slope. They've already spent over $4 billion, and they've yet to even drill a hole yet, not a single well yet. So they're going to have to recoup $4.5 billion and counting over the next number of decades. They don't even know for sure what they have up there. And so let's say they do hit, and hopefully they do, they've got to recoup billions, and with the time value of money, it's even larger than just taking a dollar amount. So that's the kind of investment that a lot of companies have to put into when they're on the North Slope, that when they look at Alaska, they see as the price of oil gets high and they have an opportunity to recoup. They don't see it here where they see it in other states. There have been quite a bit of conversations about the jobs. What's going on with the jobs in Alaska? And jobs are at an all-time high or close to an all-time high on the North Slope. And a lot of people that were really pro-ACEs have said, ACEs passed, we raised taxes, and now more people are working. Well, you really have to kind of take a look at when the increase occurred and what is going on up on the North Slope. You can see in 2006, the North Slope had a pipeline incident. It was a corrosion leak, and there have been tens of millions of dollars that have been spent in fines on that. It shut everything down up there, and a tremendous number of people were hired, and a lot of money was spent to deal with those corrosion issues. It's a 30, 40-year-old infrastructure up there. Corrosion was more advanced than they thought it was going to be, and they spent a tremendous amount of money and a lot of labor to deal with the issue. And you can see as a result in 06, and then again in 07, and then again in 08, it increased the labor numbers tremendously on the North Slope. ACEs takes effect in 2008, and as you can see, it's basically flattened out. So are the labor numbers up there higher in the last few years than they had been previously? Yes, they are. But it's to take advantage, or it's to keep a mature infrastructure going. And in fact, it looks even more depressing when you look at North Dakota that has 10 times the workers in the oil field than they had 5 years ago. Alberta, Texas, where the boom has almost single-handedly taken them out of the recession that's been going on in the lower 48, and yet you see we are just flat. Maintaining a labor number, but not seeing the explosion that's happening in every other jurisdiction in North America that produces oil. This is a snapshot taking a look at some of the capital and operating expenses that have occurred over the last 4 or 5 years. Like I mentioned, we know more now than we did then. And as you can see, the blue line is their capital spending, which increased for a few years. And you can see ACEs takes effect in 08. And 09 was the first year that companies would have been basing their spending decisions on the passage of ACEs. It creeps up, and then it starts to move back down again. The operating spending, however, continues to go up at an even steeper incline as they're keeping the mature field going. Another point to make about this is the department puts together a production forecast every year. We estimate what we think the price of oil is going to be. We estimate what we think the oil production is going to be. And then the state and the legislature base their budget decisions on what our forecast is. And traditionally, over decades, the state has been overly optimistic and continually predicting a decline far smaller than the real decline has been. So when Bruce and I came into our jobs, we said, well, let's really dig down into this and try to come to as accurate a number as we possibly can so we're not continually overly optimistic. And a lot of the reason why we found it's overly optimistic is we get the information from the operators. And of course, we talk to the Department of Natural Resources and Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, look at their permitting, see if their permitting lines up with what the companies are telling us. But ultimately, the companies that are actually operating and producing give us most of our information, and they tend to be optimistic just as a rule, because they're looking out a number of years to where their boards of directors haven't made decisions on spending yet, and they're optimistic about what they'll be spending and what their production will be, or when it will come online. And what we've learned is the information we're dealing with tends to be a little overly optimistic. Well, we've also noticed that in the spending, that they tend to predict their spending is going to be a little higher, and as we're now looking into the historical numbers, we realize that they're not spending at the level the department expected them to.
And really the important part of the last slide and this slide, and actually the next slide, is it's to get away from that bumper sticker mentality that jobs are up because of ACEs, and capital spending's up because of ACEs, and ACEs is, when we first got the job, and we heard from one group that was saying ACEs is the best thing ever, and another group that was saying ACEs is horrible for the state. And we knew, you know, is it something in the middle, or what was that story? So splitting it between the tax credits and the production tax definitely made that distinction, and there were two sides to that story. But the jobs are up because of ACEs. We addressed that. It was more of a calendar. You just lay the calendar out. And the debate should be, why are jobs flat under ACEs when we're seeing job growth elsewhere? And then capital, we saw that dip going from 2010 to 2011, and this is fiscal year 2012. And the blue line is 2012. On the lower left-hand chart is the capital spend. So it's under 2011. Now, this is 6 months into the fiscal year, so if it turns around, great, but we're certainly not seeing that trend right now. And then on the operating side, on the right-hand side, operating costs are over last year, which is not a good trend. It's costing more to produce that barrel of oil that Bryan mentioned. And really the telling story is that the top chart, which is the ANS wellhead value, and it's flat and it's consistently, $30 higher than last year. It's up almost 40%. So that's really the story that we're looking at, is why is, with the high price of oil, why are jobs flat? Why is capital spending going down? Why is it costing more to produce that barrel of oil?
And then taking a look at this slide, which I believe is our final slide, the question we're asking is comparing the governor's bill HB 110 to the previous taxes that have passed. Did the pendulum swing too far? And we believe that it did. If you look at the purple bar, that was ELF. It was an antiquated tax system. We weren't getting as a state what we should have been getting off of production of oil. Far too low. The blue is PPT, which passed in 2006, which upped what we were making. The following year, the very end of 2007, Governor Palin introduced her ACES bill, which was about where the yellow bar is, and during the 30-day special session of the legislature, they jacked it up to where the red bar is, and then the final bar, the green bar, is where the governor's bill would be taxing. And this is looking forward for the next 3 years based on the revenue forecast for the Department of Revenue. So you can see, in our opinion, that we've gone up too high. We need to come down. We're still getting our fair share by far. If the governor's bill were to pass, we'd still be by far the highest taxes anywhere in North America on oil companies, but we wouldn't be at the level that we have been. And when we talk, because a lot of people say, well, there's a problem, but HB 110 doesn't solve the problem. And obviously there's no such thing as a perfect tax bill. We're certainly willing to look at changes to it as long as they make a material difference. And in bringing this bill out and hearing testimony from the companies, BP and Conoco have said if the bill passes, they're going to spend an additional $5 billion more than they've budgeted over the next 3 years. Repsol, who's just coming in, says they're going to be spending far more than they had planned to, and we're hearing it from just about every company. So when somebody says they don't like the bill, they don't like this, they don't like that, and it's a complicated bill, our response has been, what's your solution? We're continuing to go down when everybody else and most of the states and provinces have far less oil than we do. They continue to move back up. What's your answer? And if you have an answer, we're certainly willing to talk about it. And so that's where the debate's been going in Juneau, which is the governor's open to something that will make a material change. This will. If people don't like it, let's hear what they have to say. And as of yet, we haven't heard or seen anything. It's just been a lot of talking. It's been no details. So we're optimistic that we're going to hear something. The bill's in the Senate right now, the Senate Resources Committee, where we've got 2 months left in session, and special sessions or whatever it takes. This is the number one priority for the governor, is getting this thing flattened out and turned around to eventually potentially get to 1 million barrels a day. And it's the future of Alaska. I've spent my life here, so have my parents and my kids, and I want them to stay here. And the idea that as reliant as this state is on natural resource development, that we're going to continue to see a decline when other states are doing what they have to be to get proactive, to get the development, to get the jobs, to get the income is my priority as well as the governor's.
And just a couple points that we found frustrating last session when we introduced the bill. The bill was dropped in on day one. The House picked it up and started the proceedings right off the bat. The Senate didn't have their first meeting until day 51 of session. There were only 5 or 6 meetings total, and only 2 actually dealt with the bill. So really frustrating part was when we entered this session, they said they were setting the bill aside because it didn't do what they wanted to do. Well, it never got a fair shake, never really had a hearing. And we've been waiting and waiting for what their option is, what's their fix. And the bill that they dropped in last week, well, you know, it is a placeholder, it's a tax increase. And it's a page and a half, so certainly that's not the solution. We're interested in seeing where this is going. But I think the discussion really centers around the top of that red bar and then the green bar or even the yellow bar. A lot of work went into the PPT debates leading up to it and into the ACES debates. Politics and why those things took place aside, the months that went into the modeling to come up with those systems were very, very deliberative. A lot of very smart economists with experience around the world put those things together. That delta where it jumped up into the red, it took a couple days for that part to be implemented during session.
Yeah, basically the last 36 hours of session, they added that in.
And so now Bryan and I step in 2011 and we have 5 years of information to look back at, and we're having to prove why that number that took 36 hours to produce is wrong. And we're using 5 years of information to prove it, that jobs are flat, capital spend is going down, operating costs are more expensive, and we're just not getting a very warm reception over there, and that's fine, we're dealing with it. But I find it a pretty steep double standard that the lack of work that went into that top red bar compared to the work that we've done over the last couple of years, and certainly looking back at actual information, are just, they're two separate discussions right now. And one of the most important parts, hopefully coming up soon, is public testimony. The Senate has not heard 1 minute of public testimony. Not from you folks, not from the oil companies. And that's important. They're saying, what's the problem? Where is it broken? What dollar amount, is it broken at? Does ACES work at $71, but not at $75? And it's clearly a lot more complicated than that. And it would be very helpful if we could get the public in to voice their opinion. There are a lot of local businesses, a lot of Alaska businesses that are are suffering from under this. And until we get them to the table and they have the opportunity, hopefully the Senate will allow that very soon, but they have not. We're 121 days in through the 2 sessions and they haven't been able to speak yet. So hopefully that's going to be coming soon too.
So we're more than happy to take any questions any folks might have. Yes, Wayne.
I've got a couple that sort of relate. First one is, does the state of Alaska own stock in BP, Conoco, Exxon, and our PERS, TERS, and permanent fund accounts?
Yes.
Lots, little?
A lot. They're very profitable companies. They do very well, and as a result, our investment managers buy those stocks.
So then, how do we balance the conflict as a state by being a shareholder, on the one hand, saying we want a 15% return on our investment so we can pay a dividend in the permanent fund and pay out retirements in TERS and PERS, with the conflict of being the tax man saying we want our fair share?
Yeah, it's two separate decisions being made, and of course, as we look at investing our money, that's always going to be an issue. Any big company, multinational company that does business in Alaska is going to be potentially the one that we're investing in, but it does bring up a good point where a lot of legislators are excited about the state making a lot of money, but don't seem to be particularly happy when the private sector makes a lot of money. And Bruce and I traveled to Alberta, North Dakota, and Texas to meet with them, take a look at their tax structures, take a look at their permitting, to figure if there were anything going on down there that wasn't going on up here. And one way that they looked at their relationship with business that isn't as prevalent there is they understood it's a win-win situation. If we can do a better, faster, more responsible job with the permitting, we can have an easier understood tax system that increases the investment climate. Companies invest more, companies make more, state makes more, it's win-win. Well, here, it's more of an adversarial relationship, and that's one of the things that makes it so difficult.
And one of the interesting parts is every quarter, you'll see in the paper ConocoPhillips, their quarterly reports. and they'll run them out and say ConocoPhillips made 39% last quarter, and it was over the quarter year over year. Well, we did some research into that, and I believe not this past quarter, but the quarter before, when they were up 39% in Alaska, they were up 111% in lower 48. And I looked at that, and I went through the permanent fund, and they're a top 25 investment account for us, and I was kind of angry about that. We're stifling. 39% sounds like a great number, but you have to compare it to what they're able to do elsewhere. And that also leads to the general discussion of the tax in Alaska. During the PPT and ACES debate, we were going from gross to net. Big change, huge change. So a lot of the focus was on how is this going to affect Alaska? What's Alaska's take going to be? Which was critical discussion, but now 5 years later, the Senate still seems to be in that mindset. How will this affect Alaska? And I think we need to take a step back and say, that's an important component, but we need to say, how is Alaska compared to other oil producing regions? Because if we say, if the Senate and the legislature in general comes up with okay, we're going to allow a company to make 14% return. It might sound pretty good, but if they can make 20% elsewhere, we'll never see anything here. So I think it's important to decide what the fair take is, but then you need to step back and say, okay, is that going to make us competitive with these other regions? And right now we're not competitive.
Yes.
So the ACES example that you use where there's a 90-10 split, on the new Senate bill that seems to be emerging, how would that look?
Well, actually, it's a placeholder. They said we're going to drop it in and we're going to do work later, but actually it's a tax increase where if the price of oil were to go up another $20 a barrel, $30 a barrel, over 100% of a dollar-to-dollar increase would go to the government. It would actually be a situation where the higher the price of oil got, the less money companies would be making, and they would be wanting a lower price of oil because we'd be taking in over 100% of what was coming in. So they say it's a placeholder and it's going to have further work on it, and I'm sure that's the case, but at this point it's even more progressive. They've taken the cap off that's in current law, and where up at a high $120 to $130 a barrel, where we are right now, each dollar increase would increase taxes by 0.1%. They've taken that out, and so it's at 0.4%. So it would be higher. Yes?
A lot of the examples that you're using are from North America. I know there was a fact-finding trip to Norway over the summer, I guess. Was there anything that came out of that you go, that's an interesting idea?
That's a very good question. In fact, we've heard that in the Senate Resources Committee, many of the amendments they're going to be proposing are going to have to do with how they do things in Norway. And we're going to have to take it at one amendment at a time, but it's difficult to compare Norway to Alaska in a lot of respects because they are able to work to get permitting through very quickly because they're part owners of the developments and they're a country. We've got the federal government, and as I think most of you know that Shell spent that $4 to $4.5 billion trying to get the permits to drill in the OCS. ConocoPhillips has been trying to drill in NPRA and has spent 3 years trying to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers to get a bridge across a river that they just recently got. So those are examples of things we have to deal with that Norway doesn't because they're in control of it. So there may very well be something that makes sense, and we're certainly willing to look at it, but it's hard. It's kind of an apples and oranges comparison.
And we spent a lot of time this summer deciding who we should be comparing to. There's hundreds of places that produce oil. But, a lot of people would say, well, Iraq's taking 99%. Well, we're not going to compare ourselves to Iraq. And it seems like in the past, even Dr. Van Meers, who's an economist who was in town, 10 years ago, he said our comparisons were to the Norways and some of those other places. But he says it's now shifted. And that was our point. There was a large group that went to Norway. We had the luxury of going to Bismarck, North Dakota. We were on junkets all the time. But we thought North America is where we should be looking. because while you've got the big three, we also have these tax credits that are being taken advantage of by much smaller companies. And they're not looking at Norway. They're looking at Texas and North Dakota and California. That's where they're looking to invest. So it's important that we decide who we're going to compare to, pick 6, 8, 10, however many you want. But that's who we should be comparing it to. And I think we've done a pretty good job of kind of trying to limit that scope.
Are you here?
The tax structure is just one of the components of the cost of doing business, and I assume between operating the Arctic and our regulatory structure in Alaska is also, aside from tax, a very high cost place to do business. If I understood you right, the House Bill 110 will still have us as the highest tax structure in North America. I mean, how are we going to get back on a path to growth if you look at the overall cost of doing business and we're still the highest tax structure in North America?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when we put the bill out and we talked to as many different companies that were doing business in Alaska as we could to try to get their feedback on what they thought it would be. And then when we sat together internally and developed the bill, we didn't know, I mean, for all we knew, we were going to roll it out and they were going to say, well, geez, it's better than it was, but this isn't going to make a big difference. And they did, and not all of the companies, but the majors and some of the new ones that have come in did say this is going to make a material difference. Obviously, they're not thrilled. They probably wouldn't be thrilled till we went back to ELF. A company wants low taxes. We understand that. We have to figure out a happy medium, try to find a sweet spot. And you make a good point that it costs a lot more to do business here than it does in Alberta or North Dakota or Texas, where they can just drive right off a 2-lane road, go to work. Labor's easier to get, developing's easier to get. The average development from exploration to production in Alaska is 10 years. They can do it if they really get their permits in a row. They can do it in a year down there, and so that's a huge hurdle. One of the positives we have that would make a company want to do business here, even though we have those expenses, is our pools of oil are much larger than their pools of oil. If they find something in Texas or North Dakota, they're going to have a stripper well. They're going to be producing 10 barrels a day, or maybe start with 100 barrels a day, whereas we expect to still have a lot of 50, 100, 200 million barrel fields. So it really is. They're going to pay more, but when they hit, it's going to be a bigger payoff than they get down there. Yes?
Dept Energy's CEO was on CNBC yesterday, and he said that, and they're converting from natural gas production to oil production because they find that natural gas at $2 whatever is not worth their time. But they're applying the technology of fracking, and they're finding it a lot easier, a lot cheaper, and much more cost effective to go into an old oil well in Oklahoma, Texas, California, anywhere. And will we ever be able to compete with those cheap production costs? And how much of the decline we see in production is being siphoned away by just the mere fact that it's a lot easier to produce oil in the lower 48 with this new production technology?
Yeah, I think that two questions. Question one is, it does come down to economics, and as a company looks at their economic model, what they're going to have to put in and what they can get out compared to what they can't. And there's no question that's having an effect on Alaska. In terms of the fracking question, Alaska's been fracking for decades. That's been going on the North Slope for decades. What we haven't been doing is fracking shale, which is the technological breakthrough that's occurred in the last 2 or 3 years. It's something that's being looked at up there, but it's going to take a real change. Alaskans are going to have to accept a real change in how development is done on the North Slope. Right now, most of the development's done in the wintertime, where they lay out ice roads, bring the heavy equipment in, do the drilling, bring it back out again before the roads thaw, so they do minimal to no damage to the tundra. Well, shale development is 365 days. It's continually putting hundreds of wells in. There'd be roads everywhere, and it would be a very capital-intensive development. And so the Department of Natural Resources is really looking into what that's going to take, and the Department of Revenue is looking into what the capital spending is going to be. So there is the opportunity to do it here. It is going to cost a lot more money, but we project as a department $100+ oil out for the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and almost every expert does as well. And so if we're looking at those high prices, we're going to be looking at it becoming economic just based on the sheer vastness of what the resource is, if it does turn out to be economic.
And just to put it in perspective, the Bakken has been known about for 30 years, the Bakken play in North Dakota. But it didn't become economic until price hit about 60 or 70 bucks a barrel. So that puts it in perspective, and you can drive to every square inch of North Dakota, but on the North Slope, we don't know what those economics are going to look like. We just started looking into this. Great Bear, I don't know if you've heard of them. They were here last session. Very enthusiastic group. We appreciated them bringing this to everyone's attention, but this time last year, they were predicting to be drilling 200 wells next year. And huge plans and 1 million barrels within 5 years. And we appreciated their enthusiasm, but our own Department of Natural Resources hadn't even looked into it that deep. So we asked them to slow down a little bit, and this last fall they came back with a 6-well program to start this winter and really look at what we have over there. And DNR is doing the same thing. Again, 3 Bakkens, the potential's there. But what's the price of oil going to have to remain at for a long time into the future in order for that to be economic?
Yeah.
It's my understanding that Norway set a tax structure in place decades ago and has just stuck with it. If you guys were traveling around, did you find North Dakota and Texas were more like us in changing things every couple of years? Or were they more constant? Because I would think a more constant tax structure would be more conducive to exploration.
Yeah, and they've been more constant. Both Texas and North Dakota have been more constant. Actually, North Dakota is looking at reducing the oil taxes to get even more activity. It was kind of interesting. We were there for 2 days, and one of the days we were there, they were having a hearing. The House Majority Leader has a bill that's completely opposite of our progressivity, that as the price of oil goes up, the state take drops, with his thinking being, number one, state government only needs a certain amount of money to operate, so the higher the price of oil gets, the less a percentage we need to continue to do what we're doing. Number two, it potentially will stop the size of government from exploding to the point where a North Dakota-sized population can't afford, when the oil does begin to slow or go. And number three, it acts as an incentive to companies that see, okay, here we've got North Dakota, they're only going to take what they need. Frankly, up here, and I've heard this conversation for decades, not just in the year I've had this job, 92% of our state budget's paid for by oil, and the oil companies say it scares them to death because we don't have a state income tax or a sales tax, or we don't want to use the permanent fund or this and that. So they see when things get tough here, we go through cuts to our state budget and we look at raising taxes to the oil industry. And that's something that the places we went to, they don't have the same issue. Alberta's 30% of their budget's paid for by oil. North Dakota, I think it's about a third. In Texas, it's smaller than that. So the constant percent definitely helps in those states. In Alberta, and you might remember this, they changed. They had a consultant that pointed at Alaska when ACES passed and said, you guys should be getting more, Alaska's getting more, you should be getting more. They raised it up, and the industry said, we have other opportunities in Saskatchewan and North Dakota and other areas, and the investment took a nosedive. Alberta went into a recession, and within a year, they moved things back down. And in Alberta's case, they could do it administratively. They didn't have to do it legislatively, so they were able to do that. But they went through exactly what we went through, and in fact, they basically said to us, we don't see a legislative body changing and reducing taxes until you bottom out. They really thought that the state of Alaska was going to have to bottom out and start having severe budget cuts before a legislative body would actually make a proactive decision to reduce taxes. And I said, well, our job is to make sure we don't bottom out. But it was kind of a sobering evaluation from a fellow oil producer in North America.
Just one quick point, as far as the stability, that's one thing that we heard from our counterparts in these other areas and from the private sector is simple and stable. We haven't been that. What's that?
How do we get to that then?
Yeah, well, that train left 5 years ago. And the theory was, when we came in and we were putting HB 110 together, we didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater again. It was done in 06, it was done in 07, and there have been tweaks every year since. That affects our department, my tax division, The private sector, they're always juggling and relearning a new tax system. So when we looked at ACEs in place, we were looking at how can we make changes to the existing system to try and keep a little bit of stability in place for at least a couple of years. And that's why the first thing we looked at was a cap. We take away where it climbs 0.4 up to about 120 bucks a barrel. And then it starts going at 0.1, for the new bill goes at 0.4 for the Senate. We said we're going to cap it right there. And then the other part was putting brackets in place. Right now, every time the price of oil goes up $1, it increases by 0.4%. But that new number goes back and captures every single dollar back to zero. That's very progressive. So we said, let's model this after the federal return. You know, between 10 and 20%, or $10 and $20 or whatever, that's the tax rate for that price bracket. And it made it a lot more easy to calculate, a lot more easy to understand. New investors coming into the state, they could understand it a lot better. So while we would have liked to have thrown it out and started over, we realized in order to be attractive and be competitive, we had to try and keep a little bit of the stability in place for at least a couple of years and try and correct the system that was there.
What's your FY13 budget based on the price of barrel per oil?
109.47.
Yeah, 109.47 is our estimate, and the state budget, the governor's state budget, is $94. The price of oil would have to be $94 to balance the budget. If it drops to 93, we're in a deficit. So that's scary. As somebody that's worked in the finance committees and been there at $9 and been there at $15, the idea that if it drops below $94, we're in the red is a little frightening. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate all the time that you put in.